Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. I'm going to continue covering, of course, this week, the unfolding uprisings against police brutality all across the country, and starting with a specific focus on Texas. This week, for our first segment, we're going to talk about how things have gone down with the uprisings in Dallas. To do all that, we are joined by Marissa Rodriguez, who is an organizer with the Dallas branch of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Tell me a little bit, kind of from your perspective, how this kind of protest movement started to unfold, like sort of that period from when you were kind of watching the uprisings in Minneapolis up until the first kind of moments of, when the protests began to arrive in Dallas.
Yeah, for sure. So, May 30th, there were some protests that were scheduled that were actually demands for rent cancellation. So we actually led some of those. We did that, but obviously the pulse of the nation and everything going on, we couldn't ignore what was happening with the uprisings and George Floyd, justice movement. So we definitely participated in those as well that same day. That same afternoon, it was people were pouring into downtown Dallas to demonstrate. It was this very organic movement that was happening. People who kind of didn't have a lot of direction, but didn't really feel like they needed it. People who just wanted to come out and demonstrate and make their voices heard. So they came out in the streets, in the hundreds, and people began gathering around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And by the time 4:30 rolls around that evening, Dallas Police Department decided that they didn't want to play protest anymore. So they began to deploy tear gas. They began to, hit people with so-called rubber bullets, which, are these massive munitions that are just hard plastic and can definitely maim and hurt people. And on the note of maiming and hurting people, a man who was actually just a passerby, just someone who was walking downtown to go grab a bite to eat, was hit by one of these rubber bullets in the face. This man lost his eye as a result. Dallas Police Department has that on their hands. This man is permanently maimed. He lost some teeth and he has some neurological damage in his face. He will never be the same again, just because DPD decided last Saturday, 4 or 5 p.m. that they were done with protesting. They wanted to go home, I guess. So in order to disperse the crowd, they just began to unleash these cruel methods of crowd dispersion. And, it was totally unwarranted. Everybody there was peaceful. They were loud. They were, gathered together, but they were peaceful. So that's how the week started. It has ended. We had an event just 2 days ago on Saturday. Police presence was scant. The difference between last Saturday, the 30th, and Saturday the other day is it's amazing to see. We don't trust the cops. We don't think that they're going to be nice or play nice with us, but it is kind of amazing to see how much they have seemingly pulled back their presence at our actions that we have.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of run down that again, just kind of to point out some key points here. As with every other city I've talked to, what happened in Dallas was an escalation of the violence, not by the peaceful protesters, again, so-called quote-unquote peaceful protesters. I don't much like this kind of formulation between the quote-unquote peaceful protesters versus the quote-unquote violent looters.
Right.
I think that's really a false dichotomy that's getting set up to try and divide people who are in reality very much on the same side. MLK himself, of course, said that a riot is the language of the unheard. You can go back in history to show that, like, rebellions, rebellions get things done. And that's the sort of way it's not a peaceful protest. It's not a violent riot. It's a rebellion against the system of oppression. It's a just and it's a righteous rebellion against, essentially the increasing pressure cooker of violent austerity measures economically put together with increase in police repression that has accompanied that of austerity. But anyway, what we've seen over and over again is that, like, the protest movements in these cities, the uprisings in these cities have started out quote unquote peacefully. That is to say, nobody is trying to engage in violence. Nobody is trying to engage in rioting, in looting, or in property damage, et cetera, for the vast majority of people. And it always seems to be, as was the case in Dallas as well, that the Dallas Police Department, that these city police departments, these state level police organizations, they're the ones who are escalating the situation. They're the ones who are enacting violence on the protesters and leading to a situation where people no longer feel that this kind of avenue is getting the things done. So if you show up to a peaceful protest and you just have people violently suppress you, then your two moves are either I'm going to accept my own oppression and go and sit back down and sort of wait for everything to be done and for the violent status quo to be restored, or the other option there is I'm going to advance this to the next level, whatever that might look like for an individual. So with Dallas, essentially Dallas PD beating down, firing these quote unquote less lethal ammunitions and violently injuring people, scarring people for the rest of their lives. It is the Dallas Police Department that is in danger of losing their legitimacy here. And I wonder if that's not part of the reason why, again, it's hard to tell a lot of times what the police know, what they don't know, what they're planning. But I wonder if that's part of the reason Dallas Police Department might have backed off for a little bit, is because if they continue repressing things, it'll be obvious, as it is with so much of the rest of the country, how essentially illegitimate they are as a force for quote unquote public safety.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do want to emphasize as well that on Saturday afternoon, May 30th, before a single window was broken, before any brick was thrown, before any cop car was trashed, the state troopers were in the streets. There were helicopters. There were tanks. We saw tanks. This was on the very first day of protesting. This was long before anything had ever happened in Dallas to ever, not that it's ever warranted, but there was absolutely nothing happening in Dallas to lead to a tank, one tank, let alone several tanks, let alone helicopters, let alone different layers of police and authority, quote unquote, which I say in quotes because you're right. Their authoritative legitimacy has been compromised. It was not legitimate to begin with. We talk often about the origins of policing being slave catching. And if we kind of understand the modern prison industrial complex as the modern version of slavery, very little has changed from their origins as slave catchers. So, but people are beginning to understand this. They're beginning to accept that the police are not their friends. The police do not have their best interests in mind. I'm seeing, just from the difference of last Saturday to this Saturday, you see maybe the initial layer of people coming out, your militants, your so-called militants, your people who are used to the struggle, who are constantly in the streets. To a week later, you have people, just everyday folks, just everyday people of all nationalities coming together. They're all screaming, F12 and defund the DPD, and they're all kind of saying these what a week ago, just even a week ago, was a very radical thing to say or think or to distribute, ideologically. But now this has gained momentum, and rightfully so.
Obviously, with something this decentralized, it's often hard to kind of nail down specific demands. This is very much sort of a revolutionary crisis in a very embryonic form. So, people may be decentralized, people may be unorganized or whatnot, but I'm still seeing some general prevailing trends among sort of protesters, different camps of protesters, and different like sort of what people expect out of this uprising. What sort of have you seen as far as people's demands, and where do you think kind of people's level of consciousness has been as far as like what they understand the roots of the problem to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Dallas, we have actually a coalition that's been formed called In Defense of Black Lives, and it is made up. It's a mixture of grassroots organizations, as well as like immigrant rights coalition, organizations. So you have Black Youth Project 100, as well as American Muslims for Palestine and North Texas Dream Team, and sort of these other different special interest groups who have all kind of come together and agreed upon some demands. One of the primary demands is actually being pushed forth here in Dallas, which I am, really stoked and very excited to see, is there's a movement to defund DPD that's actually going on right now. And, it's incredible to see because being an organizer in Dallas for the last several years, we know who kind of our core audiences are, whether we're doing anti-war work or refugee, crisis work, or what have you, trans rights, all these different sort of special interests. We kind of know who those core audiences are, but this movement has really brought together in solidarity and in coalition all of these different but related organizations, and we're starting to see how these organizations relate to one another. The consciousness level, I think, is raising exponentially, probably even more than we could even quantify at this stage. Just the other day, we had some speakers from the organization, Palestine, Palestine's Muslims for Palestine, basically expressing explaining the ways in which the IDF train police departments in military tactics. And so there's, calls for free Palestine at these rallies, which are, for Black lives. So it's there, the consciousness it's raising it. People are beginning to understand, if there's the connection between the militarized police and the actual military. So I'm really encouraged and kind of confident that messaging will continue, in no small part by the organizing work that gets done by PSL and all these other great organizations that we have here, that consciousness will continue to be raised and people will continue to draw these conclusions and make these make these concepts understood, so that they're commonly known. It's not just stuff, it's not just rhetoric, it's not just stuff that we're quoting from books, but actually understood in a very palpable way, in a very tangible way, in a material way, that people will understand what we mean when we say defund the police, and they also understand what we mean when we talk about BDS movement and what sanctions are and how they operate and how this translates not just to what happens in the streets in the United States, not just in Minneapolis, not just in Dallas, not just in Fort Worth, but what actually happens all over, what happens in Gaza, what happens in Latin America. So I really do feel that the consciousness is moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a convergence on many different issues here, where people are making the dots, really connecting the dots between sort of the issues. So you can't really understand, for instance, ICE detention, the essentially ICE what are often called concentration camps, these massive detention centers full of, essentially refugees and other immigrants, like the quote unquote concentration camps. I think that's a fair assessment on many people's part. So people are seeing the connections between the concentration camps, between police brutality against black and brown people within the U.S. and between the U.S. military and the way that the U.S. Whether proxy states or sort of outposts like Israel sort of function. Israel for a very long time has used Palestine essentially as a laboratory for the testing of new for the testing of new war crimes, for the testing of these kind of new tactics and whatnot. And so it really reveals the farce of the entire thing. I want to go a little tangential here with Joe Biden's comment a couple week or two back, where he said ridiculously that his plan to end police brutality was to train police to shoot protesters in the leg rather than in the head. Now, first of all, protesters shouldn't be shot at all.
Right.
You
Absolutely.
shouldn't. Yeah. But then even if you take that ridiculous, obscene proposal at face value, Joe Biden, claims that police just need to be retrained on how to use their weapons. But in fact, the training they get, Joe Biden is a huge supporter of Israel. He is a fervent, rabid supporter of the state of Israel. And as you just talked about, Israel is where people, where the American police departments get their training from on these quote unquote counterterrorism tactics, which are in fact, essentially counter protester tactics. They're tactics of a police department. They're tactics of an occupying force against a captive and unarmed population. So you can't be pro-Israel while also saying that the police need to be retrained, when in fact Israel is part of the reason that police are trained the way they are, and the other part of it is just that they're an occupying force. And I think that's very important when we talk about defunding the police, when we talk about abolishing the police. People don't realize how much of police budgets have just taken over the entirety of essentially city budgets all across the country. For instance, the New York Police Department, NYPD, spends more money per year on police. Their police budget of NYPD is greater than the entire military budget of the DPRK, also known as North Korea. And I'll say that again, that the police budget of NYPD per year is greater than the military budget of North Korea per year. In Houston, I know we just talked to an organization in Houston who said that number is in the billions, that the increase alone is close to $1 billion, I believe. I'll have to double check that. In Austin, the police department takes up $500 million. It's almost half of the city budget at this point. What does the city budget look like as far as police in Dallas? How much is Dallas wasting, or how much is Dallas spending? I guess it's not a waste if you're part of that capitalist class that sees a profit from this, but how much is Dallas spending on police repression of its own citizens? What does the Dallas Police Department's budget look like?
$570 million. That's $500 million. It's 40% of the city budget. I can only imagine what that money could be used for if it were actually spent on the people of the city of Dallas. If you drive around Dallas, anybody listening who may know neighborhoods of Dallas, but even if you don't, I'll tell you, if you go to West Dallas, if you go to Pleasant Grove, if you go to South Dallas, if you drive around parts of Oak Cliff, there are North Dallas, there are areas all over the Metroplex of Dallas proper and beyond that you feel like you're stuck in time, like you've gone back in time, and that part of town is stuck in time because there is no money being spent on infrastructure. The roads are horrible. Every time it rains, there's flooding, there's potholes that never get refilled, and they only get worse. There's no mass transit to get people from parts of town to other parts of town. For example, downtown to South Dallas, downtown to Oak Cliff, downtown to Pleasant Grove, so that people can access jobs. there's no fresh food in most of these areas of town. They're essentially food deserts inside of a major city and a very wealthy city. And I don't need to say it, but I will. These are disproportionately Black and brown neighborhoods. That I mean, I don't need to spell that out, but I absolutely will. $500 million could be spent annually on getting people resources for simple things like schools and grocery stores and transportation. That's really where we could spend this money. That's just the start of where this money could go. But instead, it's being spent on tanks and God knows what else. Training. I'm sure. Part of that money is spent on people actually being paid to train the police, to treat us as though we're enemy combatants in our own city, in our own streets. And it's enraging to think about. $500 million annually.
I know that in a lot of cities, the actual police department is made up largely of men coming out of the surrounding suburbs, kind of wealthier or more well-off suburbs or whatnot. And so because they come so far from the they don't really live in the city center. They don't really live amongst the kind of working class Black and brown populations. They usually live in the suburbs, or they live in kind of the richer outer areas outside town. And so they come into work every day, and essentially you see their jobs as an occupying force. They see their jobs the same way, for instance, again, like Israel kind of sees their military presence in Gaza or the West Bank, where they're holding down people that they don't see as human, people that they don't believe should have any rights.
Yeah, I think that's definitely happening here. Dallas, as you mentioned, in Texas, we have so much kind of urban sprawl and so many outlying suburbs and things, and they vary wildly. Balch Springs is a completely different suburb than, Flower Mound, for example. So yeah, you do have cops coming from different suburbs, surrounding areas, and everything is more or less a 30-minute or so drive away from everything else. So, a 30-minute commute is not unusual for any type of work. So yeah, you definitely have cops coming from suburbs. And they come to work in DPD and the Dallas Police Department because it's more lucrative for them, of course. So there's that element as well, that they want to come work for DPD as opposed to Flower Mound PD or wherever, because there's more money to be made in the city proper. So yeah, I think your point is absolutely on point, that they do see these neighborhoods as occupying. They're coming to occupy our states, our city streets. Just on this note of occupation, it brings to mind how in the midst of all of this, Dallas Police Chief Renee Hall has said quietly that she plans on bringing more state troopers back to the neighborhood of South Dallas, which is a historically Black neighborhood in Dallas, which is just in the shadow of the fairgrounds where the State Fair of Texas is held every year, and where many of those people who live in that neighborhood go to work. That's a whole other tangent that I often go off on about the fairgrounds. But to bring it back to Chief Hall, who is a Black woman, making these decisions to reintroduce state troopers into, this is even a level beyond just regular Dallas PD. This is state troopers. So this is a whole other level of authority to just patrol. Just to patrol South Dallas neighborhoods. I mean, I don't recall there ever being a city hall, town hall, asking the neighborhood, do you want state troopers patrolling your neighborhood streets? Because the answer is a resounding, no, absolutely not. Absolutely, we do not want state troopers who are just there to, quote unquote, solve crime, but really they're creating crime problems. They're rounding people up for absolutely no reason, just this is an impoverished part of town, which, like I said, if you drive there, you feel like you go back in time. So this is all part of a larger, more insidious plan to gentrify that side of town. This is how it begins. The state troopers show up and they say, "Oh, well, the crime rate here is so bad, the property values will drop," and then all of these real estate companies can come in and snap up all of this supposedly, tainted, horrible property because the crime is so bad. Meanwhile, the families that have lived there for generations get driven out. They get pushed out. And where are they supposed to go? The city doesn't care as long as they get these amazing, shiny contracts and can build luxury housing that nobody lives in. Right. So this is, this all goes hand in hand with defunding the police. If we can defund the police, if we can get these, illegitimate authority figures out of our streets, it's going to solve a multitude of social problems, including but not limited to gentrification.
In the last few minutes, I'm wondering where sort of the civilian government has been on this. Have they made any attempts to rein in the police? Have they made any capitulations to the protest movement in Dallas? And essentially, like where do we have to go as far as this? As far as quote unquote civilian leadership in Dallas has stood.
Yeah, so I'll kind of quickly answer that. There have been some small kind of crumbs thrown to the crowds. Renee Hall, the police chief, has said, "Oh, well, it's going to be policy now that if an officer sees another officer doing something that's against the rules, essentially, that they should be turned in." Well, that should have already been the rule. And we also know that being the case in Minneapolis in 2016, George Floyd is still dead. So these concessions, these little crumbs that they throw at us, we won't have them. We won't have them. We want the whole meal, the whole table, the whole kitchen. We're coming for them. We are gonna demonstrate that we are not going to take these little crumbs, and that we want the whole thing. So I think that Mayor Johnson, Renee Hall, the police chief, they understand very well that they are, in the movement's sights, that they are in our sights, and that we're not going to stop. And I think they have been made aware of that in the last week. But this is only the beginning.
All right, I think that's a great place to go ahead and wrap up. We were joined for this episode once again by Marissa Rodriguez, who is an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation based in Dallas, Fort Worth. Thank you very much, Marissa, for coming back on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Welcome back to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. I had originally intended to feature yet a fourth Texas city in this rebellion, but at the kind of time that we were recording throughout the week, an article was released detailing the worker exploitation in the Texas meatpacking industry that I'd like to get to in just a minute. First, though, I'd like to give a brief rundown of sort of what went on in Austin, so we can at least touch upon kind of the four of the major central-ish Texas cities, or kind of Dallas being the North Texas as well. So Austin, like so many, pretty much every other city across the country, has also seen at this point 2 weeks of sustained people's uprising against police brutality. This began actually before sort of the George Floyd killing. Just a month prior to that, there was the police killing of Mike Ramos, who was attempting to surrender here, who was basically summarily executed as onlookers begged the 6 APD officers to not shoot him. They opened fire anyway as he was attempting to surrender. So that was one of the conditions was kind of boiling under the surface. That a report that was released this year about the horrifying conditions, the horrifying, basically decades-long police retaliation, police systemic racism, and sexism within the police department. So all of that was sort of the precursor to the uprisings that we've seen in Austin. There were large protests beginning kind of later in the week. This is late May. So that on Saturday, for instance, on that first weekend, there were large, essentially spontaneous uprisings. There was an attempt by a group called the Austin Justice Coalition, a more kind of liberal-ish reformist group here, to call a protest at the Capitol. And so in many ways, this was the way that we're told protests are supposed to go down. This is the way we're told is the quote-unquote legitimate channel for protest was the way Austin Justice Coalition had it set up, where they had booked space at the Capitol. They had provided security, their own security and whatnot. So they were doing everything's quote unquote by the book of sort of the legal channel of dissent, the quote unquote legitimate channel of dissent, whether you want to agree with that or not. That's the way they went about it. And as organizers arrived at the Capitol that morning, this is Sunday, I believe the 31st of May, they found that DPS, that's Texas Department of Public Safety, had shut down the entire Capitol and was not letting anyone on the grounds, and it essentially de facto canceled the event. There was some kind of criticism between various groups as to who was responsible, but ultimately, the way I look at it, it was DPS, not any other group. It was the Texas, essentially, state-level police force that made the call that they were not going to allow this protest to happen. But of course, people were furious, people were riled up, and so thousands of people showed up at the Capitol anyway. DPS essentially immediately escalated the situation by not allowing people at the Capitol. They forced people into the streets around the Capitol, these more narrow streets than the Capitol, which would have been an open space, thereby guaranteeing a more widespread spread of COVID, as well as essentially amplifying or sort of exacerbating the people's already kind of seething anger at this system. And so that erupted into a large spontaneous protest that essentially went all across downtown Austin. It marched to the city hall at one point. It marched to the APD a couple times. It kept going around in circles. But because DPS made the decision to shut down the Capitol, to shut down this event, it went from being sort of an organized protest to something that was very disorderly. That was the fault entirely of the police systems within Austin. APD then attempted to escalate at basically every point. APD used violence against protesters, used tear gas, used rubber bullets. Tear gas, of course, is considered a war crime if it's used in war, and yet the U.S. continues to use it on the quote-unquote home front like this. So, long story short, I don't want to, sort of get into the entirety of the details here for time, but long story short, essentially, this whole protest movement continued to happen. APD wound up almost killing several people here in Austin, leaving people comatose, leaving people hospitalized, injuring, I think the number was about 30 or so, attempting mass arrests at various points. And so it was ultimately, as we saw in so many other cities, it was the actions of the police departments at the city and state level that made things more dangerous, as well as the calling in, I believe, of the National Guard. I was told it was the National Guard that was at the Capitol that day as well. So again, these police departments don't make things safer, they make things more dangerous. At this point, Austin City Council has capitulated to some minor level on some minor police reforms, but it's not enough. People are still out in the streets protesting, and this thing needs to continue to go on. It is important now that if people understand that if they were able to wrest these concessions out of Austin, the city of Austin, with just 2 weeks of protest, imagine what we could do with another 2, 4, 6 weeks or more of this sustained uprising against police brutality. So that's kind of my take on that. But I think it's also important to get into, some of the underlying conditions, look at really like what it is economically that is feeding into so much of people's anger as essentially the U.S. empire continues to, on the one hand, implode, but also, essentially turn inward, turn its forces of oppression and austerity inward even more intensely. So now, with all that said, with sort of a general overview of like the state of the 4 Texas cities I've covered in the past weeks, I want to turn again to this article titled "Pandemic Reveals Worker Exploitation in Texas Meatpacking Industry." Once again, I'm talking to organizers with the Party for Socialism and Liberation based in Dallas. So I'm joined by the authors of this article that's on Liberation News. Now we are joined by Dariel Hernandez as well as Cooper Feste. They are organizers with the Party for Socialism and Liberation based in Dallas. Thank you both for joining the show, and thanks for sitting through that kind of monologue there.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's good to, I think, really talk about the economic side of all this. This is actually one of the many protests that were happening kind of beforehand as people fought essentially the kind of austerity measures that so many corporations were dealing with. Can you just give us basically a brief rundown of kind of the conditions that people at the Quality Sausage Company in Dallas were facing leading up to a protest on May 19th, and sort of like how this company's sort of denial of the problems of COVID and complete lack of respect for their workers, complete disregard for the safety of their workers led to essentially this kind of, semi-explosive moment between workers and management.
So they had, since the beginning, since the whole, even before like the lockdown was ordered, but everyone knew about COVID, they did not follow any CDC safety standards. They didn't change anything at all. They didn't test anyone. So by the time like the lockdown happened, and then like even like a month into it, they 3 deaths occurred. There were 63 infections, and they didn't close down until April 24th, which was like a whole longer than a month afterwards. They only closed down for a couple weeks, and another worker passed a few days after they opened the second time. So they've been, the people have been fed up with how they handled COVID-19, and they've been fed up with just like how much neglect for their workers they've shown.
Oh yeah, to add to that, they didn't close down the plant until the day after a worker died, Matthias Martinez. And the next day after that, Hugo Dominguez was the next victim of basically this like negligent company. And that's kind of where the spark came from for the protest. Hugo's wife, Blanca Parra, as well as some workers, held a protest demanding, justice and demanding better working conditions. I guess to quote Parra, she said that the virus was the gun that killed him, but Quality Sausage Company was the hand that pulled the trigger. Just to put the voices of the people that are suffering in the meatpacking industry here.
Yeah, I think that's such an incredible way to pull it because, I think that's such an incredible way to put it. Really, is that that idea that it's like, who is it that's pulling the trigger here? Who is it that is making the executive decision? The U.S., I think, continues to treat COVID as sort of an inevitability that people will simply die regardless of what it is that can be done. But it's like at every level, the policies, first of all, of federal, state, and local level governments, but then the policies of companies affect who lives or dies. They have the power to affect people's health and safety in so many key ways. And yet, as we're seeing here, this company continues to make money. I believe it's quoted in the article that this company has hundreds of millions of dollars in assets or in profits that it could have borrowed from to provide PPE, to provide paid time off, to provide any number of levels of protection to the workers. And yet it was still in a kind of gross violation of what would be seen as like public safety, either recommendations or possibly even public safety regulations. We've, I think, seen this a lot across many industries. How is it that this company is able to sort of get away with this? How is it that these industries are able to function as such?
Well, I would say that they're definitely being held accountable, but it seems to not be quite enough to really affect their business. And I think that just kind of comes down to just how much exploitation that they get away with. Everything from just to go back to the conditions that they're working in. Dominguez, who passed away, like many others, was told to continue to work and ignore symptoms or else be threatened to be laid off. So I believe that these companies just basically give the workers no other choice other than to come back to work or else be replaced, and just continues. And it's that contradiction of how these companies can just replace their workforce with just about anybody else looking for work, considering the record-breaking levels of unemployment that's sweeping the nation right now.
And to your point about how they can get away with this, it ties into what's happening across the country right now. I think where if they as it's shown, if they are responsible for the death of workers, they can just pay off a settlement and keep operating. They just get a tiny slap on the wrist, and they're held to a different standard and can just pay it off.
There's been this false divide that people have seen, this false dichotomy for a very long time of sort of the enlightened, quote unquote enlightened liberal city centers that always vote for the Democrats. And that's the right way to do things versus these backwards rural Texans who live, in all these rural areas outside of major cities. I think what we've seen in the past few weeks, but especially as struggles intensify across the country in the past few years, is that in fact workers across all of these industries and workers kind of across these artificial divides actually have far more in common. Like, for instance, we've seen actually major protests in really small cities. I know that there were towns of just a few thousand people who had a few hundred people show up for Black Lives Matter protests. So I think we're seeing kind of this reunification, of workers across these different industries and across these different kind of cultural divides that's absolutely necessary. But it's also necessary to understand the difference as well, and to understand the kind of special levels of exploitation or special types of exploitation that rural workers face that those of us in cities might not have to live with on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, what when you bring up rural Texas in the article, what is sort of the main takeaways that are important for people to understand?
Well, it generally comes down, especially in East Texas, to underdevelopment. I feel like something that all rural people living in rural areas have to suffer through is underdevelopment and a lack of resources for what people need. And an example of that is that, to show the proof of that is that Shelby County in East Texas, as well as Moore County in the Texas Panhandle, both are the highest cases per capita of COVID-19 patients. And that's it's ridiculous to compare that to places like Houston and Dallas, where proportionally those small rural counties have so many more cases per 1,000. And that really comes down to the fact that over the last decade, that East Texas has been basically defunded in their healthcare. For a striking statistic, more than 1/5 of the counties in Texas just have one doctor or none at all. So what's happening in in East Texas, which in Shelby County, which is right next to Louisiana, is that the effect is that lots of people are getting sick, particularly where these meatpacking companies exist, which is near Amarillo, as well as like Shelby in the east. And people have to go out 30, 40 minutes to the nearest city to get any sort of emergency care, and up to 2 hours to a major city for COVID-19 treatment. And it just really goes to show that like this is just like a neglectful and a system that mostly just puts profit instead of what people need, which is like clinics, testing centers, as well as like, you know, places to buy healthy food, because we know that these places also suffer from being food deserts. And this disproportionately affects the Black community and as well as immigrants.
Whenever there is kind of a major outbreak, we've seen this a couple times, when there's a major outbreak in a meat packing plant or in a kind of another industry like that, that are already high risk because of the labor violations, the safety violations. When it shows up on the map, you'll see kind of reactionary people dismiss it as, oh, well, you know, there's not really a large COVID outbreak there. It's just the reason the numbers are so high is because of this outbreak at this one plant. But it's like that one plant is the people. That one plant is, those are people. And just because they all happen to be within the same industry doesn't mean you don't have a crisis within that county. Like it's that absolute dismissal of the people in those counties when they happen to work at the same place. That idea that just because they all got it from the same place, that's not an anomaly worth considering, or that's just an anomaly that's not worth considering. And you know, it just goes to show the absolute reckless disregard for people's lives that essentially our entire system has. It's built into the way the media talks about it. It's built into the way many of kind of the elites of major Texas cities talk about it. The quote unquote liberal elites as well. You know, it's a level of injustice that's baked into our entire system. So I'm wondering, it looks like we have about 5 minutes left. If there's anything else kind of from this story that we didn't really hit on, again, I want to just, kind of recap that we're talking about this article that's titled Pandemic Reveals Worker Exploitation in Texas Meatpacking Industry. It gets into especially the protests that happened in Dallas, kind of pre-COVID. And I think it's important to look at the economic, sort of the economic factors that have made America such a pressure cooker, where people feel this intense pressure to kind of rebel against the system, where all kind of legal avenues for social and economic justice are cut off to them. Is there anything else about kind of this story that you feel we didn't really get a chance to talk about?
This is sort of somewhat related to our conversation about the story, not really the story itself. We'll get to another point here in a second. But we were talking about how like there's the rural and like major city like dichotomy. I think like more so like that false view of that. I think more so there's like a suburb and like urban dichotomy, where like Dallas has food deserts and in pockets of it, and like has places where like where you can't get any food, where you don't have any transportation, and don't have like access to doctors because of transportation. While like most of the suburbs are pretty well equipped, all the suburbs like they have a good amount of doctors, just from what I've experienced. So I think like it's not about like rural versus urban.
And just to go off of that, I think a really important thing to think about is exactly how this ties into all other struggles as well. I think what really opened my eyes to that is to find out that another plant nearby Dallas in Irving, Texas, just to the west, there's a plant called a Breakbush Bros, which is a poultry plant, where there was another outbreak, which has actually increased that zip code in that area, which is primarily made up of black people and immigrants from Latin America as well as Myanmar. where this zip code is now the second highest area next to South Dallas, a historically Black area with the highest amount of COVID cases, which has actually surpassed the zip code that contains the Dallas County Jail. Just to like give some perspective of like exactly how the way our country produces things and puts assembly line speed first before people's safety can endanger workers as much, if not even more so, than prisoners. And that's not to discount the like struggle that prisoners are going through, because we're about, you know, the compassionate release of prisoners in this time. But it really creates that the realization that what we're really dealing with here is basically slave labor, because this is really heightened in the Panhandle, which the Panhandle area over by Amarillo, which is called like Beef City, USA, has a long history of immigrant exploitation, going back to the 70s with Laotian and Vietnamese immigrants, moving into like the 80s and 90s where they were exploiting Latin American immigrants, culminating in an ICE raid that was actually happening nationwide called the Operation Wagon Train, where 300 undocumented workers were rounded up and like imprisoned and dispossessed of where they're living, and those like rundown apartments that the company owns. Then moved in African refugees, like Sudanese refugees and from other parts of Africa, and basically who were seeking asylum, and their solution was to put them in company housing for the only relevant industry in the Panhandle, and they don't really have a choice to leave. They're economically bound to basically work for JBS or Tyson Chicken in that area. And it really just goes into the history of how rural areas in the United States, just as much as urban, are just as colonized as like the third world is. And of course, different conditions and different historical situations, but it's very much similar.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point in that essentially like people should understand that there are really a kind of two sides of the U.S. empire. It's an outward-facing empire, but it's also an inward-facing empire. The U.S. Empire abroad will overthrow countries or sort of, exert its control over countries, exert soft power or hard power or coups or anywhere in between to essentially force countries to accept the labor conditions that make it possible to import just massive amounts of cheap goods into the U.S. But then, on the other hand, weaponizes the chaos that it's caused in the rest of the world to sort of force those people of oppressed nations into an immigration, into a servitude within the United States as well, so that people find themselves kind of forced to work for often less than minimum wage in horrific conditions within these kind of American plants, within the agriculture industry, and whatever the case is, and so that creates the conditions for super exploitation abroad, for the cheapest possible extraction of minerals and resources abroad, and then at the same time also creates the conditions for labor violations that drive down wages within the U.S. as well. So that we share, whether you're a worker in an urban area, in a rural area, in anywhere in between, in the U.S., outside the U.S. I think what we're seeing more and more is that people share this common exploitation, this common sort of oppression and repression at a very generalized level. Sure, the specifics are very much different between those of oppressed nations, for instance, versus white workers or whatever the case is. But ultimately, we do all share that common sort of that common exploitation and that common oppression as workers. And when we are able to join in kind of the broadest possible coalitions to resist against that and to eventually rebel, that is how we win. That is how we get the demands we want, and that's how we push toward a better future. I know that's very lofty, but because of the intensity of the past couple of weeks, I think that's a good kind of way to generally wrap it up, is to understand that all of us do share this common cause against police repression, against capitalist repression and exploitation, and for sort of a just, democratic, and of course, I would say socialist future as well. So yeah, that's kind of very lofty. We'll continue covering the protests as they evolve next week, the nationwide rebellions as they evolve next week. And for now, yeah, we had a great discussion of Dallas and of Texas over the past couple of weeks as well. So for that, we were joined by first Dariel Hernandez. Thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Yeah, and Cooper Feste joined us for this episode as well. Thank you, Cooper, for coming on.
Thanks, Brianna.
Yeah, Dariel and Cooper are both organizers with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And it's great speaking to both of them. And we'll be back next week with continuing coverage of global struggles for social and economic justice.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.